afternoon, everybody. I realise that this is the last panel before lunch, so the sooner the better that we finish, then we can all go. So I am conscious of that. And it's a great privilege and honour to have with me co-panellists, Georg Vranken, Head of Telco Communications at BICS, one of the largest global carriers in the world, and Jason Titers, officially Global Connectivity CPaaS. Right? It basically means he does a heck of a lot, right across the entire Cisco range of voice and messaging requirements, and these are two very smart individuals who are going to be able to help bring a great insight into the topic. What is the topic? I think it's useful just to quote Dario at this point. Dario once described the role of number information services within this industry as really kind of being like the oil of the engine. Right? Each aggregator, each player in the A2P market, on the voice market, is running a complicated engine, delivering the services to their customers, but there's a bit of oil that is needed to kind of keep all those cogs running smoothly. And that's all to do with information about numbering. And we're going to hear lots of kind of different aspects of what type of information about numbers and how that actually helps enhance the service, enhance the engine, ultimately delivering more services, more revenue, greater quality, higher accuracy, and happy customers. That's kind of the end goal in all of this. So that's a brief introduction to the panel. Perhaps if Jason and George, a brief introduction just about your companies and about your role, please.
Yeah, of course. I think for most of you probably know me from IMI Mobile. We were acquired by Cisco a couple of years ago now and embedded within the Cisco ecosystem. Much larger organisation than we used to as IMI, but big organisation. It's great to be involved there. Myself and my team look after all of our routing capabilities, mission controls, all those kind of things. We use number information services as part of that, but I have another role within MEF as well, so I also sit on the MEF board, and it's great to hear from all the members, especially on that last session, because that was something I was heavily involved with many years ago around starting the UK sender ID registry, pulling the UK operators together. Tim was involved in that process when he was an operator. And so, yeah, it's great to see that evolve and that whole fraud framework and adding new items to it. So, yeah, please, everyone, if you're not involved in revenue insurance, get involved. If you haven't signed Code of Conduct, sorry, a quick dig on this one again, then please sign it, because it is, just about showing intent of doing the right thing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I'm working at BICS, as mentioned. BICS is a leading international carrier, for those who don't know, in messaging, voice, and mobility services. And our mission is to provide borderless communications to people, things, and applications. Myself, I work at BICS since 2010, and I'm responsible for the product strategy in our voice and messaging domains.
Excellent, thank you very much. And just as a very brief introduction to myself, so I'm Eli Katz, CEO and founder of XConnect, and we are part of a Somos group of companies. Between XConnect and Somos, we are the leading provider of trusted number information services for global connections. Our customer base is most of the audience and sense of most of the largest A2Ps, a growing number of carriers, and also identity and validation players. The good news is that we do not provide any SMS services, we do not provide any voice services. We're a completely neutral player, just enabling the industry to run as smoothly as possible, benefiting the entire ecosystem. That's a brief introduction. So I thought I'll start off with, on a slightly lighter note, just recognizing that we are in Amsterdam, and this is a very open question. You can claim the fifth, or whatever the right words are, but have you, either on this trip or on any previous trip, ever smoked anything of interest? And if so, can you recommend anything to the audience? And if you haven't, why the hell not? That's the opening question.
It's great of you to drop that question in, Ellie, from nowhere, so thank you. I have to say, when I arrived on Monday, just walking around the city, I felt as if I'd been smoking something, even though I hadn't acquired anything intentionally. Unintentionally, right. I was probably getting high just walking around the city. And yeah, that's about as far as I've gone.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah. George?
Well, the same for me. I was surprised as well, just walking in the streets. You get enough, you inhale enough, so that was an experience good enough for me. So I rather fancy a good cigar than taking a joint, to be honest.
What about yourself, though, Ellie?
No, I'm sorry. One benefit of being the moderator is that I do not have to answer questions that I pose. Just to say that this information has been recorded, has been sent off to the relevant HR departments, and know that you'll be hearing about them shortly. Right, starting onto the main note, let's discuss the panel's we're going to cover a wide variety of use cases where number information is crucial to deliver the quality and accuracy. Let's start off with the two most basic use cases. One in the voice routing world, and the second in the kind of classic A2P SMS world. Let's start off on those two core areas. George, perhaps on the voice side, the role of number information service.
Yeah, indeed. For the first use case with voice, of course, is to, and with messaging it's the same, is to determine the real network owner of a terminating subscriber, so call or SMS, and to be able to route that call as optimal as possible with the best quality as possible. So that's the first use case. Of course, in the voice domain, what is since a couple of years, which is becoming more and more important and is very important, is the OBR thing. So OBR, origin-based routing and pricing, where it's not just important to validate the B number, but also very important to validate the A number, right? So the calling number, the CLI, needs to be validated to make sure this is a valid, screened, and correct number. So that's very important to use numbering information data for that. And of course, next to that, numbering information databases that they complement a lot to our already extensive fraud analytics to provide secure and fraud-free communications to our customers.
Perfect. And just in case the audience might not be fully aware, George just touched upon the concept of OBR. OBR is origin-based rating, probably something that's not yet in the SMS world. Who knows? It might come one day. I don't think we're asking for it. It just might happen. But in the voice world, it was a fairly radical change in wholesale telecoms, literally over the past few years. And it's not as if wholesale telecoms goes through radical changes. In that sense, it was quite a unique change, whereby the charge of a given call when terminating into a network actually now depends upon where the call is originating from. Right? And that, for the last 30 years of wholesale telecoms, we don't care where the call is coming from. It's terminated to that network, that will be the charge. Once you have that environment, it's called OBR, and it started here in Europe, and most of the European operators have now implemented it, and it's growing around the world. That's only going in one direction. It's basically money for nothing for the operators at the end of the day, from that perspective. But it does introduce a whole concept of looking at the A number. And this is something that in the voice world is something that's not really anybody's really cared about, right? We all care about the B number and how to route it most optimally. But actually looking at the A number and analyzing is this a valid A number? Frankly, nobody's given a toss about. That is now changing. And that's now changing, as George says, because of OBR reasons, so for commercial management to avoid penalty charges that arise from invalid. And it's also rising from a regulatory perspective. There's big changes happening. I mentioned it briefly on the panel this morning. Two regulators in the world, UK and USA, have now implemented that you operators have an obligation to check your A numbers and to make sure that those are valid A numbers, meaning they come from allocated ranges, they're not on do not originate lists. And this is all part of that global journey we described earlier of improving the trust and restoring the trust in caller ID. But definitely George has touched upon some two very hot topics. Jason, on the sort of messaging side and wider.
Yeah, similar to yourself, we're using it for routing a lot of the time to the number of operation services. There are different qualities, but generally, even at this most basic level, getting the network right is really important. In some territories, the quality doesn't have to be quite as high because you can use off-net arrangements rather than just direct to operator. Whereas in a lot of voice scenarios like yours, it has to be on net. In some territories for messaging, it's got to be on net as well. So we have to choose the right quality of lookup service for that territory and make sure it delivers in a timely manner. That's a big part of that as well. Latency is absolutely critical there.
Good. That all makes sense, and that's part of the sort of the basic structure, which is network information that enables the optimized routing. It's just interesting to note between voice and messaging worlds, right? The slight different utilization of that network information. In the voice world, if you were to misroute a call to the wrong MNO, it will get to the right MNO. There might be an additional transit charge, there might be an increased latency on a post-dial delay, but the call will get through. In the messaging world, in certain jurisdictions, if you send it to the wrong operator, that's it. You will not see that message again. You might not get a receipt back. You might get a false receipt back. So the requirements of network information are differentiate between voice and messaging, but in both worlds are very much required. So the next question is, recognizing that a growing number of players in this room and looking at the industry at large, in the old days, I'm a voice player, I'm a messaging player, I'm a CPaaS player, etc. The new world, all of that is very much merging together. The communications industry recognizing that we want to be delivering a complete portfolio of services to our enterprise and business customers. So within looking at one organization where you're having multiple business divisions, each of them with their own requirements of this number of information services, what are the sort of architectures that we're seeing? And certainly from our perspective, we're seeing a variety of different architectures. I think it's just useful to help highlight. These are quite fundamental decisions that operators need to take, recognizing the requirement of this world for multiple business divisions. So perhaps, George, you can...
Yeah, it's an interesting question indeed, because we have different different product lines that are touching on the numbering information data, voice messaging, our fraud analytics, and also our DID number, so the numbering business as well. So they all need to plug into the numbering information data, which is coming from different sources, right? We have external vendors, we have our own databases, so they all need to touch on these with different platforms, need to access all that data. And we've chosen to take this all in a central approach, to have one central database of number information, which is being fed by all these different sources, and the different platforms, they plug into that to fetch the data, which is for us the most optimal architecture.
Okay, George, Jason?
We've got a bit of a crossbreed, I have to say, around how that works. You know, yes, do we have, I say it's more decentralized, I guess, really. Do we have some of the databases you speak about? Yes, of course we do. But, you know, in certain territories, you know, why would we necessarily use a local, well, sorry, we'd need a local database for that data to ensure we minimize the latency. So if we were doing a high volume of traffic from the US, why would we come and pull it from a centralized database that we're managing in Europe or in South Africa or somewhere else? So we're probably a little bit more decentralized at this moment in time. I can see pros and cons for both models, but yeah, we've tried to keep the data local to where it's required. And that seems to work well for our business.
Mm-hmm. I can say from looking at a variety of our customers who have gone through that journey, and obviously the ones who have gone through the journey who have started on one side and then started on the other side, and then at some point some senior vice president sits down and thinks and looks at this architecture, and you've got different boxes sitting in different places. So on one hand, the simpler approach will be to centralize that as a group requirement of the number information services. You can bring in your own databases, bring in the external vendors, supplying all the number portability information, supplying the number plan information, supplying the HLR information, functionalize, centralize that, and deliver it to each of your different business divisions, which definitely is a logical approach. I think as George was highlighting, it does require a lot of planning and a lot of thinking. It is absolutely not easy to do. It probably is the sensible path to some degree. We'll touch on Jason's path, but do not underestimate what it means to actually bring that capability together under one roof. It's a set of skill sets about managing data, managing different what we call super query, when the information is not in a local database but is in a remote place. All of that needs careful planning and architecturing. So it may seem the logical place to get to, and it probably would be, right, but it needs a lot of thought and a lot of care. Jason's point is very interesting because the role of geographic requirements, and as Jason pointed out, latency is a core requirement. And if we just compare and contrast, latency in the messaging world, so ideally if you want to have a response in kind of anywhere between 20 milliseconds and 700 milliseconds, recognizing that in certain jurisdictions, the information about where the network is going to be obtained via an HLR, and that could easily be half a second or a second worth of latency. However, if you're trying to do voice routing, and I think George will confirm to me, in the voice routing, you cannot be waiting 500 milliseconds for an information back to know how to route the call. By the time that 500 milliseconds has happened, the call is finished, the person on the other side might have even died during that time. You need to be able to deliver that call in the carrier grade real time. So the latency requirements kind of in the voice world are like really, really tight and really sensitive. And from that perspective, therefore, that's why you need to have a capability to be able to access that information in that narrow real time, and B, from a geographic perspective, you need to ensure that you can obtain that information locally as possible, so that the network time on remotely querying that databases, et cetera, is all done. Just from our XConnect perspective, that has triggered us on developing a worldwide set of nodes, literally USA, all over Europe, now expanding both to the West Coast and expanding down to Asia, just to ensure that our nodes of providing this information are available kind of within region, and therefore that can deliver the voice side and the messaging side, et cetera. Moving on to kind of some of the newer services that we're seeing and understanding kind of what the role of some of these are. So one of them, which is definitely interesting, we've only touched upon it briefly at this event here today, is the wonderful world of RCS. No, we're not here to debate it, and we're not here to discuss its future. That's the wrong panel, right? Just checking. But in the world of RCS, right, which, as we know, the train has left that station, and country by country, there are some good countries now where there's significant take-up. What are we seeing the role of number information services kind of in that RCS world? Jason?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things really. Dependent on the country setup, if in a country there are several different map providers, then again, we need to know which network a handset could be on before we can do any kind of discoverability to see if the handset even is RCS capable. So we need to do the number lookup first before we do the discovery part. In some cases, where Google might be running the whole country, it's perhaps not as important for routing. We can just pass it off to Google and they can handle it from there. But it does kick in later in the process as well, Just if one map provider might be providing route to a whole country, if commercially each of the operators have different charging mechanisms, we've got to know that our invoice and reconciliation processes and invoices to our customers are accurate and timely, What if our customer really wants real-time stats around not only deliverability, but the charges that might be applicable for it, and wanting that by network, those kind of things. Doing the lookup gives us that insight, gives us that information. We can see what might be occurring in real time, as well as fault and support type issues. It really helps us with that kind of intelligence. So yeah, not just for routing, but for other elements around it. Ellie?
Absolutely, and it's really interesting because you would have thought that the classic use case of network information is purely for routing. But as Jason was highlighting, even in countries where there's only going to be one route. It's going to be to the Google hub for that route because all the MNOs in that country have adopted the Google Jibe solution. In that case, your routing question is not a question. It's all going to Google, right? Good or bad, we're not commenting on that, right? It's all going to Google. But at that point, what happens later in the process, exactly as Jason highlighted, is that, yes, but your reconciliation, the actual money commercial flow, is going from aggregator directly to each of the relevant MNOs. So at the end of the day, you do have to know where this RCS message is going. It's going to MNO 1 versus 2 versus 3, so that when the bill is generated, right, can be reconciled back to, yes, actually, I did send 20 million messages to MNO 1. Their charge for that RCS message is XYZ, and therefore I can reconciliate that at the settlement level. So there's both real-time requirements at routing level and actually at offline requirements in that wonderful world of RCS. And we wish it good luck for that to continue and grow as much as it can. Let's take another example of another segment where we're seeing the role. So the good news for the industry, again, is with a lot of combined efforts from the voice and messaging side, we're having a lot of CPaaS-like activity. And the CPaaSs quite often are not necessarily what we call the range owners. Right? So if we look at kind of the telecom structure, right? You look at country by country, typically the structure that exists is that the national regulator will have some sort of either license or other rules-based structure how you as an entity can obtain numbering. That's kind of the first level. If it's mobile numbering, they need to fulfill certain mobile requirements. At that point, you then become a number owner. And quite often, in the new world, especially the more pure plays, IP communication, CPaaS players, are not necessarily number owners in country. And that kind of creates something interesting, and perhaps George can touch upon how that world of number information is impacting in that world of CPaaS and the actual routing implications of that.
No. Yeah, indeed. I mean, we're also very active in the numbering business and providing numbers to all our customers, having huge coverage globally, providing the ID numbers, and indeed getting those ranges, activated, opened globally across every operator, every carrier. It's a bit of a cumbersome process. I mean, you have the IR21s, which are not always up to date. That process doesn't function that optimal. So there, I think numbering information service providers can really help us to get these ranges communicated and opened across the world. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say, on the back of that, we've seen numerous issues in the industry where enterprises have come to us, not our clients even, actually, have approached us and said, can you help? This just isn't working. Our traffic for our customers isn't getting through, and our provider isn't able to assist. Can you help? I'm probably the same as yourself, and we work with other parts of the ecosystem to try and fix that, and that's where then we can go to Ellie and the team and other providers and make sure that those, I wouldn't call them hacks, I would put them adjustments in the routing can be made to make sure that everything routes smoothly and efficiently for everyone's benefit. Because at the end of the day, we're all consumers, and if we don't get those messages, those services, actually, we stop using them.
So I'm going to pick up on your point about this is not a hack, because that's actually quite an interesting statement. So why would you think it is a hack? And then the answer is why it isn't a hack. So the question why you might think it is a hack is as follows. So as I mentioned before, ultimately the in-country regulator defines the structure for who is a number owner, right? And you can be a number range owner, then you can obtain your set of ranges, et cetera, et cetera. That's I was about to say, a fairly well-defined, regulated-based structure, country by country. Along comes a player, which is like a global CPaaS player, Microsoft as an example, and typically, in nearly all countries, as an example, and I'm merely picking Microsoft as a big example that everybody knows on the Teams basis, will not be a regulated entity in country. Right? Obviously, there's always a bit of tension between whether you are a telco player, whether you're a pure CPaaS player. Again, this is not the forum to discuss that. But ultimately, it means that you end up with numbers sitting with non-regulated range holders. That's where this world becomes a bit challenging, because from our perspective, the role of a number information services provider is that we work with all the regulators around the world, we work with all the central databases around the world, we collect the number plan information, that's 7 million records with 60,000 changes every month, that's kind of the world of number plan changes, and then you have all the number portability, right, which is 100 plus countries which have implemented mobile number portability, and then of that you have millions of changes every day, sometimes you have millions of changes every minute, right? This world is a very dynamic world. But all of that is essentially within the regulated world. So when you start having the concept of entities routing calls outside of that framework of I'm a number owner, I'm involved in number portability, that's where things start getting messy. To recap the previous point, from a voice perspective, the call will get through. Right? One way or another, it will find its way through. I was about to say by magic, not quite, but it will get there. When it comes to SMS routing, that's much more tricky. And I think everybody on the panel is identifying that we're seeing a growing number of issues whereby CPaaS players are issuing numbers. Of course, the goal is these are numbers that can be used both for voice and SMS. That's the holy grail. And hey presto, yes it is, but in practice, the routing of that is going haywire. Because when you look at it from a regulated perspective, I'm now going to route the call to the number owner, who basically says, actually, I haven't got a clue what to do with this number, and it dies a miserable and fairly quick death. So at that point, the hack, to quote Jason, has to kick in, right? Meaning someone somewhere has to have the information that says, this set of numbers is now actually currently being handled by CPaaS player XYZ, deliver it to there, and therefore the SMS message will actually route correctly. And that's why, in a sense, it's a bit of a hack, right? Because you're suddenly dealing with a world outside of the pure regulated world. But it's the world there is exactly as George touched upon it, is you're now into the wonderful world of IR21s. Hands up in the audience who knows what an IR21 is? Half, okay. So that's a wonderful It's a GSMA structure whereby how operators can interact with each other, and this is all the numbering information and other interconnect routing information. But as George rightly pointed out, the access to IR21 information is murky, probably is a nice word. There's various different exchanges of that, but you can have private information. And the way the information for this type of information, we've seen it literally like a footnote at the bottom of a form. By the way, footnote, this set of ranges, this set of numbers now being applied here. So to actually bring that information in on a structured basis that allows for the optimized routing of this world, it is complex, right? You're literally dealing with kind of the regulated world, the IR21's world, taking this information together and presenting it. And literally the changes that we've seen happen when we introduce IR21 information into our number registry information is dramatic changes, literally overnight, right? We've had various CPaaS players who've said literally they've gone from 10% to 100% fulfillment, 10 times change, simply by the updating of that routing information at a NIS level. So this world is only growing, the complexity of this is only growing, efforts being made to try and work with various different IR21 sources and number information sources needs to continue to ensure that we can actually have a smooth delivery of all of this. Okay, interesting topic. Next area is, so we've discussed primarily voice, messaging, a little bit of CPaaS. Let's kind of widen the scope now to areas around identity, transaction, risk scoring. Very often these are a set of services that those kind of in the enterprise market would like to be able to offer to their enterprise customers, as we can provide additional services to you beyond your pure routing of messaging and voice, but we can bring added value to your commercial transactions, to your e-commerce activity. And in that world, the role of NIS is quite interesting and complicated. So perhaps, Jason, if you want to introduce what does that mean, the range of services in identity and validation, and how does that all work?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think if you want some detail, there's quite a lot of videos from the identity session last month that can cover detail. But for us, you know, we use quite a lot of identity services for our customers, mainly from the UK, but we use them in other territories as well. And for that kind of lookup service, we need to identify the location of that handset on the network as it stands right now. Not where it was yesterday, not where it was last week. You know, for routing, that will probably work in most countries, not everywhere. But when it comes to identity, it has to be absolutely correct, 100% of the time. So that does mean live lookups every time. And so the kind of data services for us that are on the back of it are, you know, has the mobile phone been call forwarded? So will messages or calls go to another device? It's kind of like a fraud identifier. Has the SIM card been changed? So is there like a SIM swap? All these kind of things, as well as KYC type attributes that we'd obtain from the operators. And that world's evolving all the time. I think we're running, say, I don't know, let's just say a dozen attributes at the moment. There are about 30 or so already in the UK. Some of the operators are talking about another 20, 30 more attributes. So we can mix and match to get solutions. But again, the only way we get accuracy on that is by making sure we do that live lookup. Otherwise, we're wasting a lot of time in that process. And that's critical because customers are maybe waiting for that one-time passcode, or maybe at a terminal waiting to literally complete a financial transaction. You know, latency is really important here, because if you're there waiting to buy something and you can't pay for it because the SIM swap check hasn't been done or whatever else, you know, that gets frustrating to all of us, doesn't it? You know, when your card's declined. I know, hands up those people who've had it happen to them. Yeah, okay, a lot. And so the kind of processes you do in the back end are really useful for that. So yeah, live lookup is critical.
Thank you. George?
Well, I can only concur with what Jason is saying. I mean, real-time lookup. That's absolutely critical. Yes. Yeah.
So it's important just to qualify that and explain what that means, because there's two different ways in which to obtain information, network information about a phone number. So, i.e., you want to be able to identify who is the network owner of that number, and the reason is for the routing purposes, for validation purposes that we've been describing. So, how does that information obtained? And there's essentially two different structures that exist across the globe today. One is to look at what's called a central database. So most countries, so roughly about 100 plus countries, have implemented mobile number portability. The vast majority of those countries have implemented, as part of mobile number portability, have implemented a central database, which is a country-based, organized, regulated structure whereby all the information about that phone number exists in that central database. I can announce on behalf of the UK, we have not yet done that. It is something that the UK is considering to do at some point, and maybe at some point we will actually join the 20th century, and we look forward to that happening. Come back to real life today. So that's a primary methodology today of how to obtain the network information to enable the routing of voice and everything. The downside of that methodology is all down to the update frequency of that central database. So there are some countries, in fact, the significant majority of countries today, where the update frequency of that database is on once-a-day basis. You know, the industry sits down and works out how much headache and pain they can endure, and broadly, the more real-time it is, the more pain and headache it is. So very often, it's a kind of a one-day process turnaround, so whereby you do an update to that database, and there'll be a once, wherever it is, midnight, etc., database is updated, new information comes out. And broadly within the voice industry, that kind of happily works. Some countries, actually here, just realized, yeah, here in Holland, it is done on a pretty much a real-time basis. So it's actually as a message comes out from the central database, and actually there's a real-time feed. So actually Holland is probably, actually there's only 2 countries in the world where it's a real-time feed. The States is kind of in the middle, it's about 15 minutes update. So that's kind of the variety that exists around the world. The common factor is that none of that, except for Holland, is actually in pure real time. So when it comes to Jason's pointing out, is that there are certain requirements whereby I need to know the information about the network in real time. I don't need to know what the stage was yesterday or late last night. I need to be able to do a lookup on that number, identify the network, so that I can subsequently get the relevant SIM swap information, call forward information, KYC information, go to the correct operator. The key thing is I need that information live, not from a database. And there you're into a totally new world, because if you can't rely upon the database, then how the hell do you get that information? You could write it down on a postcard, send it off to a variety of operators, wait for them to respond, and respond back. That is one methodology, not recommended. So the alternative is essentially relying upon the home location register, the HLR SRI SM lookup in SS7 terms. And without wanting to go into a lot of detail about that, that whole world of what's called HLR lookup, SRI for SM, has been a fairly grey area for quite a long time. There have been some recent really high-profile bad examples. I think beginning of this year, with that the greyness and openness of that market resulting in certain US senators having their location tracked. We're not going to go into more details of that, but it's a privacy nightmare, it is a quality nightmare, and it is all kind of under the covers. The good news is that over the past, I would say, couple of years, but more so over the past year, and efforts from people in this audience, BICS and others who are helping to implement firewalls at MNO level, is that MNOs have realized that access to this SRISM HLR information needs to be structured and needs to be recognized as being privacy enabled and looked at from a kind of contractual perspective. Within that world, there's now opportunities to bring validated, authenticated, trusted information via relationships, white relationships with MNOs, such as to enable the rest of the industry to utilize that information in a material and fair way so that the optimized routing can be done. So the good news is that the requirement is understood. Only now is that kind of legitimately being made available, and that's a lot of effort by parts of the industry, and that's all around kind of HLR access, etc. Good. I think we've got time for one more question, which is if you had a crystal ball, which I know you do, that's your day jobs, right? What would you say going forward would be some useful capabilities and functions that you would like to see from kind of number information services going forward?
Well, you had lots of discussion this morning on the robocall, spam, steer, shaken. So I think there is definitely, as you said, there is a problem with trust, there is a problem with good numbering information and validation of numbers, and I think there an industry-sourced global database of fraudulent numbers, and this do not originate list to have this really globally done industry-sourced. I think that's probably a way forward, yeah. I think that would be interesting to see that happening.
Excellent, George, thank you. Jason?
I think the most important thing really is around, I spoke about several times during what I've been saying today, is around latency. It's around how do we reduce latency, and so the way to reduce latency is to have centralized databases that can assist us, that are in real time as well, you know. So, I don't know, let's pick something like maybe RCS, you know. With RCS, yeah, we need to know the network, but we also need to know if the handset's discoverable or not. You know, what other channels could we use to integrate into that kind of data to know if it's available for that channel for delivery? And I think that saves doing multiple API calls out to different providers for those kind of services, so reduce the latency. I don't, you know, in RCS world, it's not a big concern today because the volumes aren't massive, but as the industry grows, it will need some consolidation of some of those services so that the increase can come as per Nick's forecasts. So we'd all love that to happen.
We would all love that to happen. Just to highlight on the pure latency, so we do realize that there is one physical problem here, right? There's a physical problem with those who have done a bit of physics in their school. There's it's C, yes, that little C. Anyone know what I'm talking about? No. C, E equals mc squared, Einstein's theory of relativity. So C is the constant, it's the speed of light. Sadly, it would be really helpful if we could just nudge that speed of light slightly faster, because then we could actually help your latency issue. And I actually do mean it semi-seriously, right? When you've got carriers who are like West Coast and are having to make real-time queries to the East Coast, the latency there, which literally is down to the speed of light, right, is being measured in milliseconds. And just adding another 10, 20 milliseconds will mean, as a carrier, I'm not delivering my carrier grade quality. So a 20, 30% increase in the speed of light would be really nice. If anyone has some ways of doing that, please do let me know. I'll be very excited. And on George's point, that's a very interesting, and it's something actually, it's sort of an MEF-like thought process. Maybe not MEF, maybe it's like an I3, but it's an industry association-like thinking. So George touched upon the interesting concept of industry-sourced hot list information, fraud information. So let's understand what that means very briefly in the last minute. Is you've got a whole lot of analytics that are sitting there monitoring traffic and identifying there's something fishy over here, what can we do about it, etc. And various companies around the world who have invested lots of money, time, effort, people in developing really sophisticated algorithms, near real time, etc. It would be really useful if that information that identifies literally 1:00 a.m. Saturday, right, there's a whole burst of fraudulent calls coming with Yemen CLI, right, or going to Dubai premium numbers, etc. If that information could be made available on commercial basis in real time to the industry, would really benefit, because we definitely see that the evil people out there are collaborating together. If we were to collaborate together, we can actually defend ourselves against that on that basis. Anyway, that's enough on the panel. We've got 40 seconds left, which should be just enough time for one question. Obviously, lunch is much more important. On that basis, I'd like to give a great round of applause to our panel.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.